Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord rises upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness is over the peoples. But the Lord rises upon you, and his glory appears over you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Good morning and welcome to this first Thursday online chapel of 2021 at Ambrose University. The season of the church calendar after the so-called 12 days of Christmas starts on January the 6th with a feast day called Epiphany. The heroes of Epiphany in the Christian tradition are the Magi, the wise travelers from the East who confirm that Jesus is indeed God's Epiphany, God's manifestation of his glory and his light in a world in which darkness constantly threatens its peoples. That leads me to our Thursday chapel series this term called The Day That Changed My Life. In these weeks following the Feast of the Epiphany, these are times to reflect on the many ways God's light is made manifest to us, the ways we experience God's glory in our own often surprising and unpredictable journeys of searching for, finding, and following Jesus. This term, I've asked 8 of our faculty to share their stories of personal epiphany. Call it testimony, faith story, spiritual autobiography, call it whatever you want. I believe you'll be encouraged by these stories of transformation. They remind us that authentic journeys to Jesus are about gratitude and struggle, joy and lament. They involve times of doubt and surrender and being overwhelmed by beauty or trust or love. And I need to say this, God channels his grace to us as we share our stories with each other. These stories have spiritual power. I'm grateful to all who are sharing their stories this term, and I pray that you are encouraged and that your own faith will be strengthened by each one.
Hello, my name is Darren Dyck. I teach in the Ambrose English program, and this is my contribution to the Day That Changed My Life chapel series. The first thing I want to say is that even though I'll be talking about an actual day on which something did happen that changed my life, I wasn't utterly transformed in that moment. Some people have Saul on the road to Damascus types of experiences, temporary blindness, scales falling from their eyes. Generally speaking, I do not. Or perhaps I should say I have not. It's probably more accurate to say that the day in question represents a high point in a series of connected days that over a number of years changed my life, that in truth are still changing my life. When I was an undergraduate at the University of Saskatchewan, I attended a particular church in Saskatoon. Another person who went to this church was my first-year English prof. I took her English course not because I knew her, but because I'd heard that she was the toughest and hardest marking prof there was, and I wanted to be challenged. I did well in the course, and it shouldn't come as a surprise that my professor played a pivotal role in me changing my major from history to English. That was a real conversion, by the way, just not the one I'm talking about here. I'd been going to this church for a decade. I was involved. I was more involved than I'd ever been anywhere else. I was a youth leader. I taught Sunday school. I knew people. It was an authentic community. These days I'd use the word formative to describe my experiences there. The church played a critical role in shaping me, in helping me determine what was important in life. I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that there were very good people there, and without these people, I would be worse than I am today. There's no question about that. Back to the day that changed my life. I learned a couple of years into my undergrad that my first-year English prof was leaving the church. Not the church universal, just, our church. Not only was she leaving, she'd written a letter to the church explaining why she was leaving. The letter hadn't been circulated among the congregation, a fact that, as I recall, made me quite angry, but was really not very surprising. Anyway, I heard about the letter, and somehow I got my hands on a copy. Now, just to be clear, the thing that happened, the thing that changed my life, wasn't my English prof leaving our church. That was surprising, I suppose, but people leave churches all the time. The thing that happened was the letter. It was her reason for leaving. A reason important enough that she had taken the unusual step of putting it into writing for all to read. I should say, she actually had a number of reasons for leaving. Difficulties, she called them. They were all good reasons, I think. But I'm only going to share one of them with you here. The one that sunk its teeth into me. The one I still think about today. She writes, I sometimes felt that in the Sunday morning service, and in Sunday school particularly, there was a collective unwillingness to think. New ideas were not welcome. Even new ways of stating old truths were not welcome. What was spoken from the pulpit was gospel truth, especially if it was spoken with suitable volume and emotional fervor. I don't recall whether anything in this passage struck me at the time. Things strike me now, and I still have the letter 20 years later. What strikes me now is the implied connection between volume or emotional fervor and an unwillingness to think. Certainly we see this sort of thing all the time. Those who speak loudest, those who appeal to people's emotions, tend to be believed, tend to have their truths affirmed. I was aware of this reality even then, though admittedly, it didn't bother me as much as it clearly did her. In my defense, I was only just learning how to think. A better passage is this one, which I do remember being struck by. One difficulty I had with the church is also a difficulty common to evangelicals to greater and lesser degree, and that is a strong anti-intellectual attitude, coupled with a suspicion of contemplation. The members of our church are at home with activism, with outreach programs, but not with the mind, not with simply being in the presence of God. I often felt that when I entered the doors of the church, I had to leave my mind outside. What struck me most was the phrase strong anti-intellectual attitude. I had been warned, you see, before beginning post-secondary studies that university classrooms were corrupting places, that young people entered them faith intact and left them full of doubt, questioning, atheistical. I was only just beginning to see that that assertion was, in an important sense, a lie, one that had probably been told to me with suitable volume and emotional fervor. The truth is, that anti-intellectual attitude was an expression of fear. My church was afraid. There's a line in a sonnet I teach here at Ambrose. In that sonnet, a group of people who have just witnessed the resurrection of Lazarus crowd around him. They're anxious. The poet tells us they're hungry for finished faith. To put it another way, they want answers, but not ordinary answers, the kind that lead to more questions. They want answers that satisfy them, answers that explain the extremely unsettling phenomenon of resurrection in terms that settle the matter once and for all. They want to go back to the way things were. They want, in other words, not to have to think about a thing that in truth they ought to spend the rest of their lives thinking about. Reading my English prof's letter, I realized my church didn't really know what the mind was for. Despite assertions that humans represent God's crowning achievement, they thought that thinking was only for answering questions with phrases like, yes, that's right, or yes, that's what I believe, and not for answering them in ways that are, let's say, open-ended, questions that invite more questions, further inquiry. I remember round about that time my pastor asking all of us to write down on a little cue card a question we'd like to ask God if we could. All I wrote down was, why? As I recall, those around me thought my answer strange. I still think it's the only question. My English prof left the church, as her letter stated she would, and not long after that, I too left. Here I can imagine our dear chaplain, Terry Foss, screaming internally, "Don't make your chapel talk about leaving the church." It's okay, Terry. I just went to a different church. It took some time, but when I did decide to begin attending somewhere else, my decision was an informed one. I chose a church that I guess affirmed a fuller view of humanity. Please don't misread me here. If you're thinking he left a conservative church and went to a progressive one, stop. That's not what I mean at all. What I did was find a church where words spoken from the pulpit were above all thoughtful, where sermons were not primarily or even secondarily about the person speaking. There were thankfully very few personal anecdotes. Not that there's necessarily anything wrong with personal anecdotes. I mean, this is one. Volume and emotion were still intermittently present, but they were employed to serve the ideas of the sermon. It was, to be clear, the ideas that mattered. It was around that time, incidentally, that I also learned while reading the Renaissance poet and priest John Donne that sermons could actually be arguments. This, too, was a kind of revelation, one that dignified the hearers of sermons, that trusted in their ability to figure stuff out. But I should add one thing. The church I found was not only thoughtful in its various facets. Its Sunday morning services were structured with an eye to the beautiful. And here's the key. Not simply the beautiful according to narrow modern notions of beauty. The beautiful as it has been understood and apprehended by the church for centuries. Ultimately, what my English prof's letter prompted me to understand is that no Christian need be afraid of intellect, afraid of learning. Even learning just for the sake of, thinking about things. The kind of learning, not incidentally, that we try to foster in our classrooms. Truth belongs to God, wherever it is found.
God of creation, there at the start, before the beginning of time. With no point of reference, you spoke to the dark and flushed out the wonder of light. And as you speak, 100 billion galaxies are born. In the vapor of your breath, the planets form. If the stars were made to worship, so will I can see your heart in everything you've made. Every burning star, a signal fire of grace. If the creation sings your praises, so will I. God of your promise, you don't speak in vain, no syllable empty or void. For once you have spoken, all nature and science follow the sound of your voice. As you speak, 100 billion creatures catch your breath, evolving in pursuit of what you said. If it all reveals in nature, so will I can see your heart in everything you say. Every painted sky, a canvas of your grace. If creation still obeys you, so will I. to worship, so will I. If the mountains bow in reverence, so will I. If the oceans roar your greatness, so will I. For if everything it takes to lift you high, so will I. If the wind goes where you send it, so will I. If the rocks cry out in silence, so will I. If the sum of all our praises still falls short, then we'll sing again 100 billion times. God of salvation, you chased out my heart through all of my failure and pride. On hill you created, light of the world, abandoned in darkness to die. And as you speak, 100 billion failures disappear. Where you lost your life so I could find it here. If you left the grave behind you, so will I can see your heart in everything you've done. Every part designed in a work of art called love. If you gladly chose surrender, so will I can see your heart 8 billion different ways. Every precious one, a child you died to save. If you gave your life to love them, so will I. Like you would again 100 billion times. But what measure could amount to your desire? You're the one who never leaves the one behind.